Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. We start our news bulletin from Syria, where Ankara says it has neutralized 11 Kurdistan Workers' Party militants in the country's north. The Turkish Defense Ministry says the fighters were neutralized during the Operation Peace Spring in the region. The ministry said it will not stop the operations against militants in the region. This comes after 3 PKK militants were neutralized during Ankara's operations yesterday. Since 2016, Turkey has launched a trio of operations across its border into northern Syria. Ankara holds a fighting group responsible for the deaths of some 40,000 people in a 30-year terror campaign. Russia says the militants in Syria's northwestern Idlib are not complying with the ceasefire brokered with Turkey. The foreign ministry says the militants were taking counter-offensive action in the region. The ministry said terrorists in Syria's Idlib should either be neutralized or prosecuted. It said the militant factions in the country's northwest don't recognize the Russia-Turkish ceasefire agreement. The Turkish and the Russian presidents agreed on a truce in a meeting in Moscow on 5th of March. Both the countries agreed to join patrolling along the border, but it was halted due to the rebels' protests yesterday. Meanwhile, the US, France, Germany and the UK have called on the Syrian government to stop its killing and engage in a political settlement through a UN resolution. In a joint statement, world powers said President Bashar al-Assad must accept the aspirations of Syrians who want peace. The statement was issued on the 10th anniversary of the start of Syria's civil war. The countries urged Damascus to pursue a ceasefire, reform the constitution, and release arbitrarily detained people. The statement said the Syrian citizens should be allowed to take part in free and fair elections under UN supervision. Western powers also urged the international community to assist Syria's neighbors in sharing the costs of Syria's refugee crisis. Meanwhile, Syria's envoy to the UN, Bashar al-Jafari, says Western countries should lift their unilateral economic sanctions against Damascus.
Is ending these sanctions. Number two, as I said, withdrawal of foreign troops from Syria, Americans, French, British. Number three, stopping interfering into our domestic affairs to overthrow the government, the legitimate government.
Syria has been marred by a vicious civil war since 2011 when the government cracked down on pro-democracy protests. Now moving on, Israel's President Rivlin has given opposition leader Benny Ganz an official mandate to try to form a new government. This comes as Ganz won the support from the two political parties in his bid to oust Netanyahu after a third inconclusive election in less than a year. The president gave Ganz 28 days with the option of a 2-week extension to a similar ruling coalition. Earlier this month, Netanyahu declared victory in the elections, but 61 of the parliament's 120 legislators voiced support for Ganz. It undermines Netanyahu's plan to stay in power in a unity cabinet to fight the novel coronavirus outbreak. Netanyahu is facing criminal charges in 3 corruption cases, but his trial was postponed until 24th of May due to the coronavirus. Iran has reported 129 more deaths from the novel coronavirus, taking the country's tally to 853. This is a new record high for a single day in one of the world's worst hit countries. Health officials say the virus has infected over 1,050 people in the past 24 hours. There are now around 15,000 confirmed coronavirus cases in Iran. Meanwhile, a 78-year-old member of Iran's clerical body has died 2 days after testing positive for the COVID-19. This took the death toll among the serving and the ex-officials to at least 12. The government has advised people to stay indoors and avoid unnecessary travel. New coronavirus has further tightened its grip on Europe as Italy, Spain and France recorded over 500 deaths, their highest number for a single day. The outbreak has now killed over 6,500 people worldwide and infected more than 167,000 people. Meanwhile, in China, the number of new cases has shrunk down to just 4. This report has the details.
Panic buying fueled by mass hysteria escalates as Europe and the US struggle to contain the new coronavirus pandemic. Governments across Europe are curbing travel and tightening borders The once bustling streets of Madrid are deserted as Spain's military emergency units patrol to enforce the lockdown.
In the end, giving security means giving security to all Spanish citizens, in this case Madrid citizens, where we are, so that they know the state of emergency in which we are, and they know that it is better to stay at home rather than on the street.
In the US, with over 25 million people without health insurance and a shortage of testing kits, the danger of mass community spread is real. But in China, where it all began, the virus has been virtually bottled with only 4 new cases reported over the past 24 hours.
I will praise China again and again because its actions actually helped in reducing the spread of coronavirus to other countries. The commitment of the political leadership, starting from the number one, from the president himself. And I said it in my speech, the level of his knowledge is very, very amazing.
In South America, Argentina, Peru, Venezuela, and Bolivia have also imposed strict restrictions by closing schools and imposing a state of emergency. Meanwhile, Denmark, Hungary, and Mexico have reported their first deaths from the disease.
As the COVID-19 pandemic spreads, more states are taking tougher action to stop the virus. Middle Eastern and South Asian countries have introduced new restrictions as the number of the confirmed infections grows. This report has the details.
In Iraq, the government has imposed a curfew in the capital Baghdad while suspending international flights in and out of the country. Nearly 124 cases have been confirmed so far in the country, while 10 people have died. Saudi Arabia has suspended work in government sectors except health and security for 16 days. The decision follows previous instructions to close malls, restaurants, cafes, and public parks across the kingdom. Lebanon has declared a state of medical emergency, which involves closing its airport as well as public and private institutions.
The closure of public institutions and administrations and municipalities and unions and independent businesses and public and private universities and schools and nurseries, with the exception of necessary staffing, to ensure continuity of work in ministries and government institutions, in accordance with the definite mechanism to be communicated by the government.
The number of cases in India have risen to 110, while 52 cases have been confirmed in Pakistan. Argentina and South Africa have both closed their borders, while Serbia has declared a state of emergency.
In a related development, Pakistan has closed its western borders with Iran and Afghanistan for 15 days as a precaution against the coronavirus pandemic. The decision was made at a National Security Committee meeting last week, presided over by Prime Minister Imran Khan. The Prime Minister's office said all educational institutions across the country are also shut down for 3 weeks. The office added Kartarpur corridor will be closed for Pakistanis, while Indian pilgrims will be allowed to continue visiting. The total number of coronavirus cases in the country has reached over 100 after 50 more people tested positive in Sindh province. Sindh government spokesperson Murtaza Bahab said the total number of the patients in the province has reached 80. Meanwhile, the US is beginning a clinical trial of a new vaccine developed to protect against the coronavirus pandemic today. This comes as the virus has spread to over 130 countries and territories, currently infecting over 169,000 people. The US administration says the experiment will be funded by the National Institutes of Health. The trial is set to include 45 young, healthy volunteers who will all be given different doses of the experimental vaccine. US public health officials say the trial will take between a year and 18 months to fully validate any potential vaccine. The pandemic in the US has prompted the Trump administration to declare a state of emergency, banning travel to countries with high infection rates. Afghanistan's National Security Council said the government is assessing which Taliban prisoners will pose a threat in the future. The exchange of prisoners between the Taliban and Kabul is a condition of the Doha deal, but it hasn't yet begun. NSC spokesperson Javed Faisal said the assessment of the prisoners has begun and Kabul will ensure they will not return to the battlefield. The presidential palace says Kabul will release 5,000 prisoners under a gradual process and there will be a give and take between the government and the Taliban. The Kabul administration said the release is a part of the peace process and it will happen. Meanwhile, the Taliban have rejected the conditional release of the prisoners, saying it wasn't part of the agreement. Moving on to India, where anti-citizenship protesters are living under constant fear due to notices by the government. The Uttar Pradesh police have issued recovery notices to 13 people for alleged property damages, with the deadline ending today. The authorities have threatened to confiscate their properties if they fail to pay 2.1 million Indian rupees. Talking to media, the individuals said they cannot pay the fine as they are daily wage laborers. They said most of them have lost their jobs since police put up their pictures on posters across Lucknow. 83 people, mostly Muslims, have been killed during nationwide protests against the controversial act. Pakistan's President Arif Alvi has left for China on a two-day visit on the invitation of President Xi Jinping. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi is also accompanying him during the visit. During the President's visit, a number of MOUs are expected to be signed with China. This will be the President's first visit to China, which is aimed at showing solidarity with the Chinese government in the fight against COVID-19. The visit will further cement historic bonds of trust and support between the two countries. It will also serve as an opportunity to review bilateral issues promoting peace and development in the region. 4 ISIS militants have been sentenced to death in Bangladesh for the 2016 decapitation of a Hindu priest. The men who were involved in the killing in the northern district of Panchgarh were members of the band Jamiatul Mujahideen Bangladesh. The priest was a prominent member of Bangladesh's Hindu community, which makes up nearly 10% of Bangladesh. The JMB was blamed for the murders of minorities, secular writers, publishers and foreigners between 2013 and 2016. The deadliest attack by the banned organization was at a Dhaka cafe in 2016, killing 22 people, mostly foreigners. It's time for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In France, Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo has beaten President Emmanuel Macron's candidate into a distant third place in the first round of local elections. Exit polls say Hidalgo took a commanding lead with 30%, 8 points ahead of her conservative challenger Rashida Dati. In the country's local elections, Green candidates have fared well in many big cities, leading the race in Lyon, Strasbourg and Grenoble. A handful of candidates from the far-right National Rally have been re-elected with outright majorities. In Paris, the mayoral elections follow a complicated two-round system in 17 districts, each electing a given number of delegates, similar to the US presidential process. Lists of candidates above 5% can merge ahead of the runoff, making final results hard to predict. First-round poll results could be cancelled if the second round cannot go ahead because of the coronavirus outbreak. Spain's King Felipe VI has renounced his personal inheritance and stripped former King Juan Carlos of his annual stipend. This follows allegations the king was receiving millions of euros from a secret offshore fund with ties to Saudi Arabia. Juan Carlos was Spain's first crowned head of the state for 44 years between 1975 and 2014. He abdicated in 2014 after a series of scandals sent his popularity crashing. The former king has been criticized for his lavish lifestyle and faces a probe by the Swiss financial authorities. Juan Carlos is accused of being a beneficiary of an offshore account worth 65 million euros, described as a donation from Saudi Arabia's king. A 5.4 magnitude earthquake has struck Iran's southern province of Hormuzgan. Government officials say there are no reports of casualties or property damage. Tehran's University Seismological Center says the tremor's epicenter was located 39 kilometers from the city of Bandar Khamir. It said the quake had a depth of 16 kilometers. Meanwhile, the UAE's Met Department says slight tremors caused by the quake were also felt in parts of the Emirates. In Brazil, researchers have created a digitally engineered prosthesis using smartphones and 3D printing. With this technology, they are now creating a silicone facial impression for a cancer survivor. The pioneering method has slashed the cost of the treatment. More in this report.
Denise Vicentin looked in the mirror and burst into tears. She is getting a new face after losing her right eye and jaw to cancer. Vicentin is thankful to the team of researchers at Paulista University who use a digitally engineered prosthesis to treat disfigured people.
Before, I felt people's stares, but today I can say how much better I will feel being out in the streets. I have no words.
The conventional technique to make prosthetic models is a day-long process, costing up to $500,000. The new digital method only requires a computer, a smartphone, and a 12-hour drill.
Using a cell phone today, we can perform the whole process. Using 3D images, we can make a 3D design of the face, 3D print the prototype that we need, and transform it into the final prosthesis. We don't need big investments for it.
Next year, the Brazilian team plans to open a non-profit treatment center for facial prosthetics. It already has a waiting list of potential patients.
A Chinese photographer has filmed 70 glaciers to demonstrate the threat of global warming. After filming for 7 long years, he found glaciers are shrinking. What about the melting glaciers in this report?
One young Chinese man made it his mission to get up close and personal with glaciers. They are beautiful, but they won't look like this forever. This is the warning Wang Xiangjun brought to the UN's 25th Climate Change Conference in Spain. His documentary clearly showed what's left when a glacier vanishes, a barren, desolate landscape of sand and rocks.
After I shot more than 70 glaciers in Tibet, I found that all glaciers are shrinking. What does this mean? It means global warming is indeed a very serious thing happening around us.
In 2019, China beefed up its latest plans to protect the environment, a plan that includes glaciers, forests and wildlife. It was a year in which the country's forest reserve increased by 2.1 billion cubic meters last year.
China's firm determination and commitment to ecology protection has given everyone the dignity. Protecting the glaciers and protecting the homeland is no longer a slogan, but something that everyone can strive to do through practical actions.
Wang says we can all limit global warming by taking practical action.
In Mali, no train has left Bamako's colonial-era railway station for over 18 months. For almost 100 years, the service connected Mali to neighboring Senegal. More in this report.
For several months now, no train has passed through this colonial-era station in Bamako. For almost 100 years, the Dakar-Bamako Express had connected Mali's capital to neighbouring Senegal. But since May 2018, the station's green carriages have remained stationary.
On a day like today, a Monday, Train 12 departed. It was euphoric. People were crying here, and it was a reunion. Today it is something that we miss very much. You see how the station is dilapidated today. It has become a dump. The tills no longer work. Everyone's at a standstill because there are no trains.
Since the line was closed, some 430 rail workers are out of work. An ex-railway worker, Moussa Traoré, is working on a 4-ton collection of documents which tell the history of the Bamako to Dakar line.
The archives really fall within the framework of the preservation of the nation's memory, the memory also really of the railway. Within the railway, there is the exploitation side of history, but also the economic side, the historical, and there is also the cultural side.
A rail rehabilitation plan is being discussed with several partners, including the World Bank. At the end of 2018, Senegal and Mali each promised to contribute €15 million as a boost. But according to the trade unionists, the money has still not yet been paid.
Lows and the highs of the business world. Now, in an extraordinary step, the US Federal Reserve has slashed its interest rate to nearly zero. It also announced a slew of measures to unfreeze credit markets. In a statement, the Federal Policy Setting Committee said the decision was taken in light of the coronavirus outbreak's impact on the US economy and global financial conditions. The Fed slashed its target range for the benchmark federal funds rate by a full percentage point to between 0.25%. The Reserve said it is restating its bond buying program, with purchases of at least $500 billion of US Treasury securities. Under the new measures, buying bonds will include $200 billion of mortgage-backed securities. US President Donald Trump has praised the Fed interest rate cut, calling it a good news.
Very happy, and I want to congratulate the Federal Reserve. For starters, they've lowered the Fed rate from what it was, which was 1 to 1.25, and it's been lowered down to 0 to 0.25 or 0.25. So it's 0 to 0.25.
Earlier this month, the Federal Reserve already trimmed interest rates by half a percentage point, its first emergency cut since the 2008 financial crisis. Now, moving on, China's manufacturing activity has contracted at the sharpest pace in 30 years in first 2 months of 2020. Containment measures amid COVID-19 severely disrupted business activity in the world's second largest economy. China's National Bureau of Statistics said industrial output fell by 13.5% in January and February, the weakest reading since January 1990. Fixed asset investment has dropped by 24.5% year on year, defying economists' expectation of a drop of around 3%. Meanwhile, China's central bank has pumped cash into its financial system through open market operations to maintain liquidity in the market. It injected over $14 billion into the market via the medium-term lending facility. Stock markets across Europe have tanked, mirroring steep declines in the global bourses. Coordinated stimulus actions by central banks across the world failed to calm panic-stricken investors, fearing deeper economic damage from the coronavirus pandemic. The CAC 40 in Paris has crashed, trading over 10% lower as Air France KLM stocks plunged about 17%. Frankfurt's DAX is trading at over 8.5% lower, following the government's announcement that it's closing borders. London's FTSE 100 has lost over 8% after airliner EasyJet tumbled over 28%, while British Airways parent IAG dives over 22%. In Asia, Hong Kong's Hang Seng led the losses, closing over 4% lower. Shanghai Composite, Seoul's Kospi and Nikkei 225 lost the ground. Meanwhile, international benchmark Brent crude oil price has plunged over 6% following the oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.news.